the new theater of the mind. The Clown Prince of Doom. The Bruce Collins Show, daring to take radio past the point of no return.
Welcome back to the Bruce Collins Show. We're very glad to have you join us. Tonight we talk about modern myths with Paul and Phillip Collins. The Bruce Collins Show airs every Friday night at midnight right here at WWPR 1490 AM. You can currently listen to past archives of the Bruce Collins Show at FringeRadioNetwork.com. That's FringeRadioNetwork.com. There's a tab just for the Bruce Collins Show on the Fringe Radio Network website. But I have a special announcement this week. On May 1st, the Bruce Collins Show is moving from Fringe Radio to the Intrepid Paradigm Broadcasting Network. So moving forward, you will find archives at ipbn-fm.com. That's IPBN, which stands for the Intrepid Paradigm Broadcasting Network, ipbn-fm.com. Or you can actually just go to intrepidparadigm.com. Again, that's ipbn-fm.com. We will be streaming the weekly radio show at 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific on that website, and then it will also air on WWPR 1490 AM at midnight Eastern, 9 p.m. Pacific. And then, of course, you'll be able to find archives at ipbn-fm.com. The Bruce Collins Show is moving forward by the grace of God, and we're honored to bring you along with us. If you find our show to be of value, as we think it is, we would appreciate it if you're able to spread the word for our show by word of mouth, social media, or in whatever creative way you can. Also, we have a Facebook page for the Bruce Collins Show. Please like us there and join the Facebook hijinks and hilarity. And you can email the show at bruce_collins_show at AOL.com. The Bruce Collins Show also has a new YouTube channel. Go to youtube.com, put in the Bruce Collins Show in the search box, and you'll be led to the Bruce Collins Show YouTube channel. Please subscribe, listen, and if you think they are of value to you, please share our free videos with our thanks. You know, lately in my exercise routine, I've been using these 5-pound dumbbells. Speaking of that, I'd like to introduce my co-host. He's a former contributing editor for Defense Watch magazine and a former contributor to the Michigan Journal. In 2006, Chad ran for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives in Michigan's 14th Congressional District. He served 7 years on active duty with the 82nd Airborne Division, 2nd Infantry Division, and the 5th Special Forces Group. His military service as an infantryman and intelligence analyst took him around the world with service in the countries of Jordan, Egypt, South Korea, and Panama. Chad is a member of the Veterans of Foreign Wars and the American Legion. He is also the founder of Sling and Stone Outfitters. You can find out more about Chad and Sling and Stone Outfitters at his website, chadmiles.com. He is radio's lethal weapon, Chad Miles. Hey, Chad, welcome back.
Hey, Bruce, what's going on? That bio gets longer and longer every time you read it.
I know. Now, do you want to know what's going on?
What is?
We're doing a radio show. That's what's going on.
What is going on?
We're doing a radio show. That's what's going on.
No, I'm sorry. What is going on?
Not much.
It's like we got stuck in that time machine again.
It is. And I feel like I've said ipbn-fm.com 100 times.
That's okay. You know, you only said it a dozen times. That's fine. People can remember it better that way.
Yeah. Just like eggs. A dozen.
A dozen. A baker's dozen. We'll make it 13.
That's right.
Hey, I'd like to remind our listeners that we are broadcasting tonight on WKID 1490 AM.
Yeah, we're broadcasting on Wait a minute. We're broadcasting on WWPR 1490 AM, Chad. What are you doing?
Well, I promised my kids I'd mention them on the show tonight.
What is with you? We can't mention the wrong station or the program manager at WWPR is going to pull the show. Let's move on, please.
Hey, Bruce, we haven't talked for a few weeks. What have you been up to?
I went to WrestleMania, and I also went to a wrestling convention called WrestleCon.
Really?
Yeah.
How was that?
I just used the word wrestle 3 times in a sentence. Unbelievable. I almost messed up doing it.
You didn't say wrestle.
That's right. Oh, I have a funny story. I met a lot of wrestlers and saw a lot of crazy people. Actually, wrestling fans in the olden days, when people thought it was kind of real or it could be real, they called it kayfabe in wrestling. You can look up the word kayfabe, but kayfabe basically meant if you were in wrestling, you kept the secrets. And so back in the day, when good guys went out to eat, they could only go out to eat with other good guys. The bad guys, called heels, ate at restaurants with other bad guys. They couldn't mix. They weren't supposed to mix. If they did, they'd get fined or whatever happened to them. And so wrestling drew a totally different audience back then, to the point where you'll hear all these old stories, and you wouldn't believe it because you'd think, okay, 50 years ago, the morals were better back then. But back then, obviously, wrestling wasn't always attracting the church types or the Christians or things like that. There were some, of course, but there were a lot of rowdy people at these events. And there are stories of old ladies who hated the heel so badly that they would pretend, to lean over and maybe give the guy a hug, and they had a razor blade in their teeth and they'd cut the bad guy.
What?
And classy Freddie Blassie, who some people may remember him when he was older, he was a manager in WWE, but when he was a heel back in his day, the fans found out which car was his in the parking lot and they burned it to the ground.
Wow.
I interviewed Ivan Koloff for this show, and he's a preacher now. He's a Christian, but he's an older gentleman. I mean, he was back in the kayfabe days. He beat Bruno Sammartino at Madison Square Garden for back then it was called the WWF title belt. And he talks about stories where he had to fight his way to the dressing room. People hated the bad guys because the bad guys, they thought they were actually bad guys. So they were really, they really wanted to kill these guys.
Wow.
And they were just family men like the good guys were. They were just, normal, whatever you call normal in wrestling. But interestingly enough, nowadays, you've got more of a family element, but a lot of these wrestling conventions attract kind of nerdy, almost it seems like the same kind of people that would show up at a Star Trek convention. And 3 years ago, I went to something called Wrestle Reunion, which was in LA, and some of the same people I recognized, the fans, were there at this WrestleCon. So they must go every single year all across the country to take pictures and whatever. But I met the tag team Demolition that was really popular in the 80s, and I was wearing this leather jacket, which is kind of funny in itself because I bought this leather jacket as a joke because there's a company called Hey Band, boy, I hope they don't sue me, but anyway, HABAND. You can go to their website, heyband.com. They are not a sponsor, so I don't care if you don't buy anything. But they were always sending me this junk mail with all these things. Get 5 shirts for $10 and all this stuff. And then they had these leather jackets for $28 on this thing. And I said, I got to see what this is all about, right? So if you're friends with me on Facebook, the picture I took with Demolition and those others is a $28 leather jacket. And I know it's going to fall apart someday, like a sleeve is going to drop off or something like that. But anyway, so that's the story of this jacket. So I'm there posing with Demolition, and they were standing to my left and right. And the one guy in Demolition, I think his name is Smash. He says, "Hey, nice leather jacket." And I said, "Thanks." And he goes, "Where'd you get it?" So I told him. And then he said, "What is it? Naga hide?" And the other guy, whose name is Axe, or he goes by Axe, he said, you know why they don't make Naga hide jackets anymore? And I said, why? And he goes, there are no more Nagas. And I said, they're doing shtick. They're doing shtick right here. I couldn't believe it. I don't know how they set me up for that joke, but or if it was organic, maybe. But that's bizarre. But
I'm sure they probably come into contact with about 30 fans a day with leather jackets.
And they probably use the same joke.
They probably use the same joke.
Yeah. So anyway, another thing that happened to me lately is that I've decided to counsel people who are scared of giants.
Oh, really? You mean like somebody who has a fear?
Yeah, exactly. Now, I know you, Chad. You're going to turn this into a joke. I don't mean the San Francisco Giants. I mean people that are scared of Nephilim or giants, and they think they really exist today. I want to counsel people about that, and I'm in the process of actually writing a book about it, and I hope to be on everybody's show. So please invite me when it's published. In fact, I've named the medical condition. I've coined the phrase for this medical condition.
Oh, you have? What do you call it?
Fee-fi-phobia.
Oh, give me a break. That's not true.
All right. Well, I guess we should move on. Chad, do you have any news this week?
Well, I'm glad you asked. I think I do have a few interesting stories. Starting with this one. Researchers are now preparing a study seeking to confirm that dog slobber by itself might provide human health benefits, such as relief from asthma, allergies, and inflammation. Specialists from the University of Arizona and the University of California, San Diego point to existing evidence of the comparative healthiness of dog-owning families and suspect that canine saliva, like yogurt, may have unusual probiotic value. That's from the San Diego Union Tribune.
So why don't you just buy yogurt? Why would you buy canine saliva?
You know, I had to laugh when it said like yogurt. Is that like the same viscosity of dog spit in yogurt? Is it the same thickness?
Yeah, and what are they going to sell dog yogurt now in like a milk bottle or something like that?
Dog spit yogurt.
Because there's only one problem, of course, if you have a dog. When I was a kid, this is terrible. I'm going to admit something that's probably going to scar my listeners for life. When I was a kid,
confession is good, Bruce.
Yeah, when I was a kid, my brother and I used to go next door to this lady named Mrs. Adams, and she had a southern accent, and real nice lady, but you know, she was the neighbor, and when my mom had to work part-time or whatever, we would go over there, and they had a chihuahua, a very nervous chihuahua, and my brother figured out that if you opened your mouth, the dog would lick inside your mouth. Now, of course, I wouldn't do that today unless I knew it was healthy. But you know, there is a problem with that. Do you
probiotics.
Do you know where else a dog licks?
Oh, yes, I'm very familiar with that.
Yeah, so now I probably wouldn't do that.
They're very
all things
flexible.
Considered. They'd lick inside your mouth and they'd lick themselves.
You know what? This next story is connected.
Uh-oh.
An entrepreneur, it's connected you'll see. An entrepreneur in Seoul, South Korea guesses that his Thanks to Nature Cafe will be a big hit, with sheep wandering through the dining room. Owner Lee Kwang-ho said his novel business model has attracted visitors from Macedonia, Saudi Arabia, and New Zealand, among other countries. That's from The Independent in London.
That's crazy.
I'm going to say something about this. I own goats.
Yeah.
And my goats do not care where they go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
Okay? It doesn't matter. They'll just stop and go.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. Now, this isn't like a dog or a cat. These are sheep.
Right.
That are wandering around. I'm guessing, now I don't own sheep, but goats are pretty close to sheep. I'm guessing goats are the same, sheep are the same as goats. And they're just going to stop and go.
Yeah.
Wherever they feel like going. That's not a place I would want to eat.
No.
lunch.
The ambiance might be a little bit strong.
Now, do they have a little, a Korean person walking around immediately cleaning up after the sheep?
Probably not. Hey,
probably not. That was a pretty good pause.
Good
timing.
We used to have a rabbit in Tucson. We had a little rabbit, and they have poop marbles. Do goats?
Yes, goats do the same thing. Yep.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing sheep are similar.
Probably.
So you're gonna have these, chocolate covered raisins spread all over the floor.
Yes, but it's a hit apparently with Saudi Arabians and people from New Zealand and Macedonia.
No comment. Moving on. Fred Horn.
Yeah, there's a lot of bad directions we could have taken that, isn't there?
I know. I'm trying to extricate ourselves from that story quickly. Fred Horn of Columbus, Ohio, no relation to Tom Horn, burned down his house in February trying to smoke the bed bugs. But Tom Horn's
house did burn down. That's weird. I should probably edit that. Anyway, go ahead.
As soon as I said Tom Horn, I started talking about his house burning down. I thought, maybe that wasn't such a good idea.
Oh, that's one of those organic moments. Oh, man.
Okay, I'm going to start over.
If you can.
I'm laughing because I remember Tom Horn talking about all these ancient texts he had in his house.
Yeah. And I mean, it's not funny that his house burned down, but yeah, it's just the weird similarity that happened there.
Okay, let me get control of myself, and I'll start over again. Okay. Fred Horn of Columbus, Ohio, burned down his house in February trying to smoke the bed bugs out of his couch. Only that one piece of furniture caught fire, but carrying it out of the house, Horn got stuck in a doorway and the blaze spread.
Oh,
that's
man.
from WBNS-TV in Columbus, Ohio.
Yeah, that's pretty bad. Try explaining that to the firefighters.
So did he
try to smoke out bed bugs?
Bed bugs.
Yeah.
Did he get like a shot of adrenaline? And was he able to, because I couldn't pick up my couch.
I know.
By myself. Maybe he had a small couch.
Maybe if your couch was on fire, you could.
It's like when, those mothers can pick up a car that falls on a child or something.
Yeah.
Superhuman strength.
It might have just been better to put water on the couch, though. Then carry it.
Maybe you should have just gotten a new couch.
Yeah.
Smoking. So did he have like a beekeeper smoking device and a hazmat suit on?
I'm not sure.
I could just picture that in my head.
Yeah.
I'm going to smoke the bed bugs, honey. You might want to go catch a movie or something.
I don't know. Something strange going on there. I wonder if that's even the full story.
Probably. You're probably right, because if he had a little bee smoker, I don't think he would have burned his couch and burned his house down. I think he was smoking something else, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Moving on. Devin Gazelle, 17, and 2 underage accomplices are the most recent burglars to make off with a deceased person's ashes, believing that they had swiped cocaine. Okay. Disappointment resulted from the very first taste or snort, and the remains were immediately tossed from the getaway car. That's from St. Peters, Missouri.
What'd you do with Grandma? She's in my nose. Oh, crazy.
I'm glad we got a dumb criminal story in there.
Yeah, we have to have one, on a regular basis.
And where were they storing these ashes for this person?
That they would think they were cocaine.
In a baggie?
Hey, you know what? You know where you can get some really good cocaine? The funeral home.
There's this place called a crematorium.
Yeah. They got good stuff.
They got piles of it.
Yeah.
Oh, boy.
Well, Chad, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Well, as always, Bruce, thanks for tolerating me.
Oh, we do more than tolerate you here, buddy. In a moment, Paul and Phillip Collins join us to talk about the myth makers of modernity. And joining me this week are Paul and Phillip Collins. Paul and Phillip Collins are the authors of The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship. I highly recommend that book. Again, it's The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship by Paul and Phillip Collins. They also write regularly for the website conspiracyarchive.com, and they also write for the Vexilla Regis Journal. They're working on a new book called Invoking the Beyond, and they've recently written an article, The Myth Makers of Modernity. Paul and Phillip, welcome to the Bruce Collins Show.
Thanks so much, Bruce. Hello, Bruce.
Hello, and it's always great to have you guys on. Now, in regards to your article, what was Immanuel Kant's contribution to efforts to dispel the ideas of the soul, God, and the supernatural world?
Well, although the abolition of man's treasured metaphysical propositions was probably an unintended consequence of his philosophy, Kant's arbitrary epistemological barrier between noumenon and phenomenon still resulted in the eventual relegation of the soul, the noumenal realm, and God to epistemic incertitude. The implication of Kant's bifurcated epistemology was that the mind constructs a map of the world that is potentially disproportionate with reality. So we can never really know what you would call the Ding an sich, or the thing in itself, the contents of the intelligible world. In fact, we can never know the objective reality of anything, including God. We are essentially hopelessly lost cartographers whose mental maps of reality are really just unreliable. With Kantian philosophy, one finds the chronically reiterated theme of man's purported epistemic alienation from the world. And this theme echoes the cosmological pessimism of Gnosticism, which also depicted the world as illusory at best. The world as we perceive it is illusory, one of archonic bondage in which man finds himself perennially trapped and alienated. Of course, Kant was a theoretician of the Enlightenment, which was arguably a Gnostic revival. At any rate, there are significant problems with Kantian philosophy. First of all, there is a considerable amount of terminological inexactitude surrounding Kant's invocation of the term noumenon. In the ancient world, noumenon was etymologically related to nous, or mind, and it typically alluded to Platonic forms. However, Kant seems to use the term to denote the actual world that is potentially misrepresented by phenomenon. Arthur Schopenhauer criticized Kant for redefining noumenon, and this criticism really does hold sway. Kant never really adequately defined his terms. Moreover, Kantian philosophy is really just self-refuting. If objective reality is perennially unintelligible, then you could never establish that unintelligibility as objectively true. So you can see where that claim is self-refuting. But nevertheless, the epistemic incertitude engendered by the Kantian rift eventually gave way to the epistemic certitude of atheism, which in turn transitions into autotheism. As Father Frederick Copleston demonstrated in his famous debate with Bertrand Russell, epistemic certitude concerning the non-existence of God, which is basically atheism, stipulates the atheist's assumption of omniscience. After all, one would have to possess infinite knowledge in order to definitively conclude that no being with infinite knowledge exists. Now, while such a claim is obviously self-refuting, it attains the semblance of sense when situated within some variant of the pantheistic framework. And suitably, Richard Dawkins, who is a new atheist, calls pantheism sexed-up atheism. And in turn, pantheism leads repeatedly to this notion of human divinity. Thus, atheism tends to segue into autotheism. And materialism actually affirms this autotheism. Self-sufficient immanent order, the sole constituent of which being matter, would really qualify as a deity, albeit an impersonal deity, an unhypostatic deity. If God is matter and matter is God, and the homogeneity of reality holds sway, then the strictly material organism of man must be part of an intramundane divinity. And again, this was probably not an intended consequence of Kantian philosophy, as is evidenced by Kant's critique of Spinoza. However, the Kantian rift, this bifurcation between noumenon and phenomenon, engendered the epistemic incertitude, the agnosticism that would eventually transition into atheism.
In your article, and you touched on Spinoza just now, but in your article, The Myth Makers of Modernity, which can be found at conspiracyarchive.com, you talk about Spinoza, Hegel, and Darwin's ideas, and the idea of them being world-affirming. Can you go into that?
Yeah, well, they are only ostensibly world-affirming. They only superficially affirm the world. And this affirmation is surmised on the basis that these ideas bestow metaphysical primacy upon the ontological confines of the physical universe. All three of them, Hegel, Spinoza, Darwin, either explicitly or implicitly advance a strictly immanent notion of God. According to the pantheistic view, divinity actually indwells the material world. Hegel's Weltgeist, Spinoza's Deus sive natura, and Darwin's Tree of Life all qualify as just such a divinity, an intramundane divinity, a pantheistic God. However, a docetistic cosmological attitude lines the edges of these outlooks, as is evidenced by their common preoccupation with change. You have in Darwinism, you have Darwin's transformism, you have Hegel's dialectic entailing the ongoing collision of binary oppositions. You find in all of those a tacit fixation upon change. And this fixation ultimately results in the rejection of any objective reality and the enshrinement of relativism. The irony is that all of these views uphold change as a universal invariant, thereby demonstrating the relativists' insistence upon certain objective immutable truths. At any rate, these theoreticians, Darwin, Hegel, Spinoza, their preoccupation with change bespeaks an overall dissatisfaction with matter in its present state. Change becomes the means by which matter is perfected, but not without the destruction of materiality as it presently exists. And herein is a docetistic cosmological attitude that one finds in the pages of certain Gnosio-Hermetic texts, which depict matter as a superficial shell from which a nebulous good reality can be extracted. Of course, that extraction would entail the discarding of the shell itself. And this tacit docetism is typically expressed destructively. For instance, the radical environmentalist movement, which is just an outgrowth of Spinozism, seeks to save Gaia by eradicating surplus populations through policies of technological apartheid and curtailing birth rates. Another example is Marxism, which is derivative of Hegelianism and disseminated on the popular level as communism. Herbert Marcuse, who was a Heideggerian Marxist, condensed the principles of Hegel's dialectical logic to a single relativistic aphorism, and that aphorism was, "That which is cannot be true." In other words, reality as it exists is a simulacrum. It's a fake. It's a hologram. Thus, it is a malleable construct that can be resculpted through violent political activism. All that exists cannot be. It must be burned to the ground. And this tacitly docetistic cosmological attitude is best described as a fire in the minds of men, as you'll find in Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Possessed. Yet another example is eugenics, which is an outgrowth of Darwinism. Like the ancient Gnostic, the eugenicist assigns an ontological status to evil. They concretize it as defective genes. The extraction of good reality from matter entails the expunsion of defective genes through compulsory sterilization, abortion, infanticide, and selective breeding. So the ideas of all these men, of Darwin, Spinoza, of Hegel, the ideas of all these men actually devalued the world and subjected it to constant disfiguration by perennially discontented revolutionary movements. Orthodox Christianity stands in opposition to such devaluation. Orthodoxy upholds the Lord's assessment of the world in Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, wherein he deems it very good. These other outlooks, Hegel, Darwin, Spinoza, they're only ostensibly world-affirming, but in actuality, they denigrate matter, and therefore they really qualify as just upgraded forms of docetism.
I want to ask you about, part of your title is The Myth Makers of Modernity. There's real myths in the context of your article. So talk about mythology in the context of this article, The Myth Makers of Modernity.
Certainly. Myths can be divided into two distinct categories. There are myths in the transcendent sense, and then there are myths in the pejorative sense. Myths in the transcendent sense allude to truths beyond themselves. Such myths are exemplified by St. Justin Martyr's concept of the spermatikos logos. In his first apology, Martyr contended that while the logos, the Word of God, is fully revealed in Jesus Christ, it still edifies all of humanity, even in the ages preceding the arrival of Christ. All of those philosophers who cherished true reason experienced the Logos. Martyr names among those philosophers Heraclitus and Socrates. Martyr expanded upon this primordial epistemology concerning the Logos in his second apology, wherein he contends that every truth discerned by philosophers was originally possessed by Christianity. And he synopsizes this contention with the declaration, whatever things were rightly said among all men are the property of us Christians. Martyr stated that while pagan teachings were heavily distorted and embellished, they contained fragmentary glimpses of the truth because the seed of the Logos, the spermatikos logos, resides in all men. And the superlative features of pagan philosophy acted as segues for one's introduction to the fullness of the truth embodied in Jesus Christ. In short, not all religions are true, but certain truths can be found in all religions. And I want to make that abundantly clear. I'm not promoting universalism or ecumenicism here. What we're talking about here is fragmentary intimations of the truth in other religions, the fullness of the truth being in Jesus Christ. And this was a position upheld by one of the earliest church fathers, St. Justin Martyr. Those truths that can be found in other religions include general recognition among other cultures of a coming Messiah. To be sure, that recognition is typically buried beneath several layers of either embellishment or distortion or both, but it's nevertheless there. For instance, in pagan testimonies, the exact nature of the Redeemer and the redemption he would bring was occasionally rendered inaccurate by cultural biases. Nevertheless, the recurrent messianic motif that surfaces throughout various pagan historical narratives and mythologies underscores an imperfect yet universal acknowledgement of a Savior. For instance, expressing Roman anticipation of the Messiah, Tacitus writes, and I'll quote him verbatim for the edification of the audience, quote, "People were generally persuaded in the faith of the ancient prophecies that the East was to prevail and that from Judea was to come the master and ruler of the world," unquote. And this promise was echoed by Suetonius's account of the life of Vespasian, wherein he states, quote, It was an old and constant belief throughout the East that by indubitably certain prophecies, the Jews were to attain the highest power, unquote. Of course, pagan Rome and the Sanhedrin were inclined to misconstrue this power as political hegemony instead of power unto salvation to everyone that believeth, as St. Paul writes in Romans chapter 1, verse 16. But nevertheless, you have there a recognition of the coming highest power being Jesus Christ. Quoting a contemporary writer, Suetonius reveals that the Roman authorities were so threatened by the promised arrival of a new king that they commanded the murder of every child born that same year. Of course, this mandate was tangibly enacted with the brutal effectiveness of Herod, who ordered the massacre of innocents. And in the Eclogue 4, Roman poet Virgil presents the emergence of a golden age in conjunction with the birth of a child. And he invokes an image that immediately begs comparison with icons of the blessed Theotokos. And Virgil basically states, quote, "A chaste woman smiling on her infant boy with whom the Iron Age would pass away," unquote. The Romans were not the only ones who anticipated the arrival of the Messiah. The Greeks also awaited him, as is evidenced by the Greek dramatists' constant allusion to a Redeemer who would liberate man from the primal eldest curse. In Prometheus Bound, Aeschylus writes, quote, "Look not for any end, moreover, to this curse until God appears to accept upon his head the pangs of thy own sins vicarious," unquote. Therein you have the redemptive mission of Jesus Christ. Within this very same work, Aeschylus would also offer a portrait of God's sworn adversary, whose temptation of Eve facilitated humanity's fall and necessitated the sacrifice of a Savior. And this pagan iteration of the fallen angel, we'll probably discuss this later, but this, again, elucidates the pagan world's imperfect recognition of universal biblical truths. In addition to Aeschylus, Plato and his mentor Socrates consistently referred to the Logos and a universal wise man who was yet to come. So you can see where myths of the classic period, myths of the ancient world, actually do allude to certain transcendent truths. In contradistinction to transcendent myths, there are myths in the pejorative sense, and these myths elucidate no transcendent truths, nor do they impart any praiseworthy virtues. Instead, they merely present falsehoods that affirm hubris.
Again, we're gleaning some very important information here this week. Paul and Philip Collins have written the book, The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship. They regularly write for the website conspiracyarchive.com. We're referencing the article, The Myth Makers of Modernity, which is found on conspiracyarchive.com. And also Paul and Philip Collins write regularly for the Vexilla Regis Journal. Expand on what you just said. How have myths changed through the ages up to this scientific age?
Well, modern myths portray science as this new gnosis whereby finitude might be circumvented, the material cosmos can be manipulated, and the pneumopathological desire to become God can be realized. Just look at the imaginative constructs that populate modern myth and consider their tenability. A self-sufficient immanent order that originated with an infinite regress of contingent agencies imbued with the causative powers reserved for the divine. A sorcerous process dubbed evolution, wherein teleological forces inexplicably guide species toward an irreducibly teleological end. A natural order that is rendered intelligible only by the gnosis of science. A new man rising from the cadaver of his own slain humanity. None of these elements of modern myths are logically sustainable. So you can really see where they really don't elucidate any sort of transcendent truths. They really don't show us any sort of truths that are to be found in sacred scripture. They don't show us any truths to be found in ourselves. They really just affirm vanity, affirm hubris, affirm arrogance, and affirm that pneumopathological yearning that has been with man ever since the Garden of Eden, ever since we heard the utterance, "Ye shall be as gods." That is really what modern myths really are designed to affirm. They don't elucidate any truth whatsoever, transcendent or otherwise.
How were Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, two giants of capitalism, influenced by Darwinian principles?
Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller both saw competition in the natural world, which is integral to the secular theodicy of Darwinism. They saw that as a correlative of competition in the world of business. So competition amongst species is further expressed in the microcosm within a human civilization as competition amongst businessmen, competition amongst socioeconomic classes, and obviously those in that view, those who rise to the top, those who attain primacy in the business world must have been evolutionarily preordained to have done so. So they're the most fittest to survive. So it's really survival of the fittest extrapolated into the realm of business, into the realm of finance, and into the realm of overall corporate world.
Now, in your article, The Mythmakers of Modernity, you write, monopolistic capitalism's accommodation of Christianity to Darwinism necessitates either the reinterpretation or total omission of certain passages from sacred scripture. Can you? That's a very important point. Can you expand on that?
If you're going to try to accommodate monopolistic capitalism, which is viciously competitive, which really doesn't have any place for mercy, which really has no place for pity for the weak, if you're going to attempt to accommodate the scriptures to that, then you really have to overlook biblical injunctions against greed. You have to overlook biblical injunctions to provide for the poor, to show compassion, to show mercy to them. So you're going to be removing sizable chunks of scripture, or you're going to be reinterpreting them, in which case many of the scriptures that might have been interpreted in a Calvinistic sense as there being this preordained elect, you could situate that within the context of the business world and basically depict businessmen as the elect, as the ones who were preordained by God to essentially seize the reins of industry and become the elite of the elite.
And I think it's good that I let the audience know here in Tampa that there's two people that I really recommend, or actually three people, that I recommend in this field of conspiracy, studies of conspiracy and parapolitics. And that would be the Collins brothers. And again, they've written the book, The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship. And I'd also recommend Patrick Wood's work. He recently wrote a book, Technocracy Rising. Both of those, or all three of those authors, I think you will find very important in your study of this type of information. So please write those names down, Patrick Wood and Paul and Phillip Collins. And, of course, we're talking with Paul and Phillip Collins this week. Now, what are we to make of the Enlightenment's versions of Satan in Paradise Lost and also the mythical Prometheus?
Well, what you find with the Enlightenment's conception of Satan or Lucifer, and by the way, Enlightenment theoreticians actually included him as part of the iconography of that movement. In Dennis Diderot's encyclopedia, you'll find emblazoned upon the title page a artistic representation of Lucifer, along with several Freemasonic icons, the compass and other Freemasonic items. What you'll find with that is a reconceptualized, redefined version of the fallen angel. Now, they did not view Lucifer as a literal metaphysical entity. They didn't give their assent to any sort of existential status for him. However, they viewed him as a symbol of the cognitive powers of man, of that which is innate to man, this potential to basically use the powers of reason to render the natural order intelligible, thereby being capable of manipulating it and essentially becoming God. You see this belief, these autotheistic tendencies in the work of Condorcet, for instance, who promoted what he called a natural salvation, which for all practical purposes was a reiteration of Gnosticism's anthropocentric soteriology, of man effecting his own salvation through the instruments of science, through his own reason, and they viewed Lucifer as the symbol of that. Now, with Lucifer, you have this relationship between him and Prometheus. And the reason that is probably because the ancient world recognized some sort of dissension in the heavens. They recognized the fact that there had probably been a heavenly rebellion, and that there was probably a personality that had led that rebellion, and that individual was dubbed in the pagan world by Hesiod and Aeschylus Prometheus. And the Romantics actually recognized the parallels between Prometheus and Lucifer. It was Percy Shelley who wrote on some of the parallels between the two. But with Prometheus, you have Prometheus returning to prominence in the realm of myth with the rise of communism. In Marx's 1841 dissertation, he mentions Prometheus. He basically gives a confession of Prometheus, and I'll read it verbatim for the edification of the audience. Quote, "In a word, I hate all the gods," unquote. And Marx presents this confession, quoting Aeschylus, but he presents it without the rejoinder of Hermes. Now, in the original version of Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound, Hermes gives a rejoinder. He offers a rejoinder to this very misotheistic proclamation. He says, well, you've gone mad. He said, I see that you have become stricken with no small madness. And by omitting Hermes' rebuke, Prometheus's rebellious declaration is kind of caricatured as being noble, heroic, and that became kind of the new conception of Prometheus, the way that Marx depicts him in this dissertation. And we have, with this new conception of Prometheus, the emergence of what could be called the Promethean faith, which basically depicted science as the soteriological torch by which man would effect his own salvation. But you have Marx tacitly construing Prometheus's pneumopathological utterance as a justifiable objection to the allegedly thought-suppressing outlook of theism. And this, his isolated quotation leads unfamiliar readers to surmise that Misotheism is a legitimate sentiment to hold, and that revolt against God, who is venerated by institutional religion, is noble. And of course, the favorable depiction of Misotheism and heavenly usurpation are not new, as is evidenced by 3rd century Gnostic texts like the hypostases of the archons. But Marx's confession merely reaffirms the Gnostic revaluation of God and his dethronement. And this revaluation began to surface during the Roman era. Before that, the Hellenic myth took more of a punitive approach to addressing the theodical problems of cosmic rebellion and Misotheism. But this version was upheld by several of the theoreticians who defined modernity. Among them was Voltaire, Nietzsche, and of course Marx. Therein, Prometheus becomes the hero of revolution, and likewise you have, with this reconceptualization of Prometheus, you have the emergence of revolutionary movements who appropriated Prometheus as the symbol of revolt. And revolt became synonymous with revolt against God, with the striving towards the pneumopathological yearning to become like God. And you see this with, for instance, with communists and the fascists. You have this drive to basically expunge God, to destroy God, while simultaneously drawing the supposed hypostatic projection of the best features of man, which were encapsulated with God, back into man, thereby transfiguring him into God. And so it's really, Prometheus and Lucifer have become the symbols of all the various new political, Gnostic political religions.
So let me see if I understand this, and correct me if I'm wrong. So then if Prometheus and the Satan of Paradise Lost are the substitutes of true evil and the devil of the Bible. What is the substitute for God? Is it, and creation? Is it enlightened man, or is it more complicated and diverse than that?
Actually, you said it in a word. It's enlightened man. Again, Lucifer and Prometheus become mere symbols for the cognitive powers of man, which supposedly will help man effect his own salvation through the instruments of science. By science, he will be able to manipulate the natural world. Therein you have the tacitly docetistic cosmological attitude, where reality, where the material world, where corporeality are caricatured as a simulacrum, and one that can be manipulated, basically changed to suit one's own whims like a god. And Prometheus and Satan, or Prometheus and Lucifer, have come to represent that to the modern revolutionaries, who again really qualify as modern Gnostics.
Paul and Philip Collins are the authors of The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship. I highly recommend that book. And they write regularly for the website conspiracyarchive.com. They're working on a new book called Invoking the Beyond. And they have recently written an article, The Mythmakers of Modernity, and you can find out more about this article at conspiracyarchive.com. And here's a piece of trivia. Philip Collins is the only one I know of any guest that I've ever interviewed who has a day named after him, from the city of Vandalia, Ohio, November 7th, 2011, was named Philip Collins Day. How cool is that? Paul and Philip, thank you so much for joining me this week.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you so much for joining us here at the Bruce Collins Show, where you can find us every Friday night at midnight here at WWPR 1490 AM. Remember, God loves you. We do too. Don't give up.